everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to do some immersion dyeing of yarn with fiber reactive dyes. And specifically, we're going to be using these fiber reactive dyes like I would acid dyes and using them as my box of crayons to create some fun immersion colorway on yarn. I have not played with my fiber reactive dyes that much. I've done more like kettle dyeing to get more of a solid color and playing around with them on plant-based fibers. But today I want to focus on animal fibers. And I know there's so many dyers that, because I know there are so many indie dyers that will use fiber reactive dyes as their primary line of dyes from Dharma. And this is probably because of the versatility. You can use them on wool or you can use them on cotton. With wool you need acid, with cotton you need soda ash. So, you need an acidic condition for the protein fibers and an alkaline, a basic condition for the plant fibers. But let's just use these just like I would any other acid dye and see what kind of magic we can create. Now, before I show you the yarn and the colors, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Meredith. Meredith, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. Our yarn today is Wool to Dye For's Diamond Sock. This 2-ply yarn has so much bounce to it and shine. It is 80% superwash merino wool, 20% silk. Whenever you dye yarn, things are always going to look darker when it's wet than it will when it's dry. And that's especially true with a silk blend like Diamond Sock. This is something that we have done with a lot of comparisons with this because I use it in my spring or summer mini skein mini series next to different non-silk blends, and then we can just see that it does look less saturated overall, which is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It just means that if I want the colors to be intense, I'm gonna need to add a little more dye than I think I might need to, which can make me nervous. I'm gonna add just plain tap water to this. I'll figure out the amount of acid I wanna add later. And then I'm gonna let it pre-soak for at least an hour, probably a couple of hours, just to make sure things are very well saturated. I found that this particular yarn base is more absorbent than some other silk blends, but silk in general needs a little bit more time to pre-soak. Over the years, I've been really nervous around fiber reactive dyes, mainly because when you use them on cotton, tie-dye can stain a bunch of stuff really easily, and with tie-dye kits there's always some mess involved, and so I was always nervous about staining. And then when you tie-dye something, there's always a ton of washing in the end, which is not my favorite part of dyeing anything. And so that's something that has made me nervous about using them. But when you use a fiber reactive dye as acid dye, the dye bath will run clear, because if you were going to make a Venn diagram of dyes, I think all fiber reactive dyes can be acid dyes, but not all acid dyes can be fiber reactive dyes. And so it'll work in that same way, and I just need to feel confident about it. Now, the other reason why it's okay for me to feel a little bit hesitant and nervous is that I'm not as familiar with these mixes. I don't really know how they break, which ones strike slow or fast. And so it's like I'm using a different brand of acid dyes, even though it's within one company, if that makes sense. Since I'm planning on using dry dye powders today, I'm gonna end up with excess dye on my gloves. And so I realized I need a yarn mop. Right here I have a skein of Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn, and I'm going into a leftover dye bath from another project that I did today. And I'm gonna need to remove this water and reset the dye bath, but I figured, why not start off with a light blue on our yarn mop? I'll just have to remember that this is not from those fiber reactive dyes. This blue is from Caribbean blue, which, is just a pretty soft blue. And now I can go reset our dye bath. But this yarn is super absorbent. As I reset, I'll just set this aside and it'll finish cooling because this dye bath is still very hot and we'll get ready to go. I pulled 5 fiber reactive dyes for today's project. I pulled some black, which is Raven, Dragon's Heart, which is this really cool broken green, Royal Blue, Alchemist, which is like this blue and purple color that breaks with a hint of like almost brown or rust. And then I have Grape, which is just a nice purple. And I think this is the palette that I'm going to use today. Now, one thing that I don't know if it's what I've learned or what, but when dyeing t-shirts and cotton, I started using, I did some ice dye recently. I did a ton of dye because I realized I think I'm not using enough dye to get saturated, vibrant colors. But today I'm treating it like acid dyes, so I'm going to use it like acid dyes. But I think when it comes to dyeing cotton, I'm going through these colors way faster. But anyway, I need to go prepare a yarn mop for today, and then we need to set up our dye bath, and then we're going to get ready to go. This is my 4-inch deep full-size catering steam pan, and the stains you see on the bottom are from when I used it to dye a rainbow shirt. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 16 cups of water and 4 tablespoons of white vinegar in here right now. And I'm going to come over with the 300 grams of yarn. Now, what's funny about this being stained, and it was also partially stained from a different project I did, but the staining happened when I had soda ash with the fiber reactive dyes. But in the other pan where I had vinegar with the dyes, maybe it was the same pan, but I did one first, I didn't get staining. So I don't know if this pan is getting old and made it more susceptible to staining or what. I stained one of the pans once with alcohol ink, and that came off eventually, but I'm planning on adding enough color today that I don't think it should be an issue. So with 16 cups of water, we have a lot of water in here. If I wanted something lower immersion, I could have used 8 cups. But what I want to be able to do is when I add the dyes in, the goal isn't to go for speckles. The goal is to add the dye in areas and then work it through so it goes through multiple layers. But first, I'm gonna need to heat things up. And we're across 2 gas burners on my stove, one here and one there. Now that we're hot, I'm going to turn the heat down to low just so it's a little less steamy so my gloves don't collect moisture. And I'm going to put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so we can dye our yarn. I'm going to start with a little bit of each color. And the main reason for speckling it around like that a little bit before I come in to move the dye through is that I don't want to clump things too much. So this is our Raven, which is reading very, very purpley to me. I think I'll be adding the colors a bit more randomly in a bit. I just want to get a feel of how they're going to play with one another. Here's that Dragon's Heart. It also comes from not knowing all these dyes super well. And we may end up with some speckles. Like, the Dragon's Heart is seeming to strike pretty quickly because it did not spread that much. I'm learning already I can go heavier. Here we have Royal Blue. You know, maybe what will end up happening is I'll go heavier on the other side. So 5 colors, I'm getting, okay, this color is more potent. But again, I think I am going to end up with some speckles. Like, there'll be color on color speckles, which is fun. But I do think, what color is this one? Grape. I do think that I will rotate the yarn before I add more and then go random on that side. Which, it's harder to go really random. Not impossible when you have your skeins laid out like this. Just because if you want to get every color on every skein and you want that level of consistency, that can just make things a little bit trickier, but it's not impossible. One way you could do it is to do diagonals, and you could do random patches, so that way instead of the color going all the way across, you have patches of each color, if that makes sense. Now, in between each color, I'm coming in with Alchemist,
In between each color, I am wiping the dye powder off of my gloves. I'm going in heavy this time. I'm wiping the dye powder off of my gloves, onto the yarn mop, covering the dye container again, and then drying my hands before going into the next dye container. Ooh. Oh, this is so like navy. It broke. I'll try to pop up a picture of the shirt that I dyed where I got the ice dyes to break. I think that this palette is super, super pretty. I want to blend and let these colors layer more, but I don't know how long it's going to take for them to set. So like there's a bit of pink left and a fair amount of that color too. Okay. I love that I'm getting some speckles from this. Yeah, I didn't really have a huge idea what to expect with them and how quickly or how saturated different things would feel. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes. We are still very steamy. I'll turn the heat back up to medium. And then we'll come back, and even if not everything's set, then we'll flip to dye the other side. But I'm excited so far.
When you're using fiber reactive dyes with soda ash, you're gonna form a covalent bond, a permanent bond between the fibers and the dye, which means that you cannot break that bond. It is permanent. You can't disrupt it. Now, the pigments could fade over time in sunlight, but that's a different story. Now, with acid dyes, you get a really strong interaction between the dyes and your yarn, but that interaction can be disrupted, specifically with heat and potentially with higher pH, an alkaline pH. And this is why we always recommend washing hand dye yarns with cold water, so that way you don't disrupt the interaction between the dyes and the yarn. Which is not something that I'm saying because, oh, you need to worry about that in a big way. It's just that I think that there's knowledge that fiber reactive dyes can be very permanent, and that isn't always the case when you use them as acid dyes. That interaction between the dye and the yarn is going to be the same type of interaction. Still really strong and really good, but just a different mechanism. And it's because when you're dyeing cotton in alkaline conditions, the functional groups on the molecules that will bind to the yarn, giving you that covalent bond, some of that can react with the water. And this is why you have to use so much more dye when you're dyeing cotton, because some of the dye will never bind to the yarn because it'll interact with the water in those alkaline conditions. And with acid dyes, that isn't something that happens, and so you're able to get all of the dye you add, as long as you don't add way too much, to bind to the yarn. And therefore you can use a lot less dye to dye wool than you need to dye cotton. At least this is my understanding. I do have a chemistry background, but I don't have any degree in like dyeing things. And I guess in that respect, I'm self-taught. But let's go back to our yarn. Okay, you know, that color was feeling more navy before. Now I see almost like a musty teal, but with some like pink speckles on it in a way that is really quite satisfying. This color spread more, I'm checking. It's looking like everything has set, which is good to know because like you use new dye colors, you don't really know how they're going to behave. Now, I will say that contrary, we got some good spread. Now, contrary to some other silk blends where there are times when I've said, rightfully so, that silk requires like more time for colors to bind, this yarn is very absorbent in terms of color, and so I find that colors tend to strike pretty quickly. And so, which is great because then I can treat this just like I would any other superwash wool yarn. But let's go ahead, speed things up, and apply color to this other side. I have a feeling I'll flip multiple times, but I'm excited to like randomize things a little bit more. Sometimes when I go to film voiceovers for a video, I film it before I do the actual dyeing. Well, today I did the dyeing first, and oh my gosh, I am so in love with this colorway. Oh my goodness. I started with mostly our sapphire, our dragon's heart, and the grape, layering those around, and then brought in some of the Alchemist, that like teal, deeper blue, and then bringing in some raven speckles near the end. Now it feels like there's a ton of color in here, but the thing I'm most excited about is how muted a lot of the colors are. I know that grape isn't a bright purple. The sapphire blue, is that what it is? Or the royal blue? That is a fairly bright blue color, but the rest of the palette I have is so much more muted, which is immediately giving this moody vibe without blending things out too much. And that is something that I don't do as often with the acid dye line, mainly because even though, yes, there's a lot of colors, there's a brightness to a lot of them. There's not a lot of muddy in between hues, and I think that there are way more fiber reactive dye colors. I could be wrong, but it's just using like a different set of crayons, and that is so much fun for me. I did start to get a little bit nervous because it seemed like I was adding so much pigment, but part of that was also because of the way these colors are looking under the water, and things still started to really strike pretty quickly. Although I did have a feeling that when we flipped the yarn, there would still be a little bit of color left in the water. As for those black speckles that I added, they don't seem particularly sharp. I didn't mix them with citric acid, but they did seem to spread a little bit more. And earlier I did observe that the Raven had some red speckles in it, which is just something to keep in mind. If you have a favorite black that you like to use for speckling in the fiber reactive dye line, please let me know which one it is down in the comments below. It has only been 10 minutes since I last added dye, so I figured I'd do a final check here together. You see how the colors and the patterning is a lot more random now than it was? There are some lighter pieces, but I honestly don't mind because I think that that adds some really nice contrast. I could go ahead and layer in more color, but the thing about having different depths within a colorway that's as busy as this is that that'll bring in dimension into our yarn. And if I had, I'm gonna set a timer for 20 more minutes so this can finish heat setting. But just like how adding like dark speckles on a lighter base can bring in some dimension and visual interest, I think these more pastel areas will bring that as well, especially when you bring in the shine of the silk. So I'm very, very excited. And our yarn mop is super beautiful. I'm gonna go ahead and steam set this for 30 minutes. We'll wash this one off camera. And I'll see you in about 20 more minutes when this yarn is ready to go. I started removing this from the water and I forgot to film. It's so pretty. Oh my gosh. I am in love. I adore this combination. I'm gonna set this aside to cool completely. The yarn mop's gonna finish steaming, and then once that's done, I'll let that cool, and then we'll wash the yarn. I was just too excited. I couldn't help but remove it before I turned on the camera. Whoops. Let's wash Meredith's yarn, which I know on camera everything's just looking super dark right now. Oh, these colors. I mean, I love how it's almost like we have like a navy, a deep purple, and forest green, but oh my gosh. Things are gonna be more muted in the end. Let's add a little bit of some dish soap. So I know it'll be lighter because of the silk, and then also it'll be lighter when it dries. But I was a little nervous to overdo it and have some bleeding. But I will happily say that the yarn mop had no color bleeding, and this isn't either. Oh, that is so refreshing. Oh my goodness. I'm excited to play around with these colors more. But I think it's hilarious that I have used these colors only a handful of times, and already it feels like some of them are starting to get low. That's because, again, I mentioned this like t-shirt video I just did, where I used, the only one of these colors that I used was the royal blue, but I like caked that dye on top of the ice. Because you know, I wanted to get something saturated. And gosh, I feel like I'm gonna need to make a second short of that because I think one of the pictures I had underneath, one of the shirts I had underneath the ice came out looking even cooler. But the main one I was dyeing was a poly blend, so that's why the colors aren't that saturated. But anyway, I don't think I'm even showing all that to you here, but this yarn is awesome. Awesome, awesome. Okay, it's funny. I'm gonna need to try just specifically speckling with it because I don't think the speckles necessarily speckle well, but they gave a great dimension, so I'm happy. I'm gonna put it through my spin dryer to remove the rest of the liquid and hang it up to dry. This yarn turned out stunning. I love the way that the colors are all a little bit muted, but not being super muddy. Oh, it's just delightful. The colors both struck to the yarn quickly, but not super quick. We don't have a ton of speckles that we can see from far away. There's a few large ones if I zoom in really close. You can see a few dotted around here. But overall, these fiber reactive dyes were easy to work with. Now, could things be more pigmented? Yes, I think things would be a lot more pigmented if I had done this on a superwash merino nylon yarn instead of a superwash merino silk yarn. But that's something that we just know with this yarn base. And if you're wondering, oh, it didn't speckle really very much because of the silk, this yarn base does speckle very well. It works up very similarly to other sock yarns that I dye. It's just the colors are a little bit more subtle. And by subtle, I guess I mean less saturated. But this yarn has the most amazing drape to it. It is so soft and like it does have a shine to it, which I don't know if the camera's picking it up. Also, because of the way we have some pastel areas, that also gives makes it feel like it has a little bit of shine too. But oh, it's so smooth. I absolutely love this yarn. And Meredith, I hope you do too. Meredith, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really, really hope you're gonna love this yarn, and I appreciate your support so much. If you at home want to learn how you become a lab partner like Meredith, go check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. And don't forget to check out all the other hand-dyed yarn that is available. We even have some really fun mystery offerings like the 2025 ChemKnits Hanukkah yarn samplers. Woohoo! Those all feature a 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon yarn in either fingering or DK, and you get a mini skein of hand-dyed yarn to open up every night of Hanukkah while watching me dye it in a new yarn dyeing video. There's extras and cards and so much stuff. You can learn more about it in the Etsy shop, and I'll have it linked down below. Meredith, thank you again. I didn't forget about our yarn mop. It's interesting to me how unsaturated some of our colors are. Like here, like the black doesn't really have a punch. It doesn't feel black to me. It feels more muted. Or is this supposed to be the black? And maybe that's one of the other greens. I don't know. I would say that as far as the yarn mop goes, and I mean, I didn't steam set it. Did I put it back in solution? I don't remember how I heat set this one. But yeah, maybe pigment for pigment, there's less, I don't know. Things just aren't as saturated as the yarn mops often are, but I'll have to do some playing around with using these fiber reactive dyes as acid dyes more to learn more about them. But I do think that this is really beautiful, and that, well, it's reading more mint than blue, but the base that I got with leftover acid dyes to start with really works well with all the colors. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I feel like this video is an excuse for me to push myself more. And to remember that the way to get more comfortable with a technique and with doing something is to try over and over again. And if things aren't working the exact way you think that they should, keep trying, right? And I mean, I gotta listen to my own advice sometimes because we created magic here, and Yeah, I'm just so happy. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I just zoomed in and I had to take a moment before I did the sign off because oh my gosh, this is so pretty. But thank you so much for watching.